Anyone who makes their living on the sea knows the spell it casts with its great majesty and its romantic lure. But when the ocean turns violent, it is a life-threatening force. Ships toss and turn like cardboard, and there is nowhere completely safe. The Grand Banks, home to one of the world's harshest climates. Located 300 kilometers off the southeast coast of Newfoundland, it possesses beneath its ocean floor a hidden treasure: oil. It is known as the Hibernia Field.
Exploration drilling had started in the Newfoundland offshore in 1966 in the Grand Banks, and Hibernia in 1979 was the first successful offshore exploratory well on the Grand Banks.
In 1981, drilling expands and a new rig is put in place, the Ocean Ranger. It's the largest rig in the world. But rigs like this aren't anchored to the ocean floor. They're semi-submersible, floating on giant pontoons 24 meters below the water.
Because they're floating, they're like ships in many respects, that there's a balance of forces, that you have to have more weight low in the oil rig than up high.
In 1982, Joe Burry is working as a welder on the rig. He's not one to shy away from danger, but he tells his family about the problems he sees. Joe has worked in the oil industry for years. He and his wife Lillian have 4 sons, with another on the way. Clayton is the oldest, at 15.
Every time he was home, all 4 of the boys would be with him. He was a very talented man. He could lay his hands on anything and do it. He was a guide, and of course, he had a way with people, and he was very well liked.
Bob Arsenault also works on the Ocean Ranger. Like most of the men on board, Bob has to spend a lot of time away from his wife and children.
Dad was very strict, but very outgoing, very caring, very, very good to my mother. Just a great supporter. I mean, we always had everything that we needed. We never did without. He was just a great man. I think my father was a workaholic. I think he enjoyed his job immensely.
The Ocean Ranger, like all semi-submersible rigs, has 2 huge pontoons filled with seawater. Running up from these pontoons, 4 on each side, I think, were large columns, huge columns, which then supported the deck and all the machinery. In all semi-submersible oil rigs, other than the Ocean Ranger, the ballast control room is on the deck. But for some reason, the Ocean Ranger design called for installing ballast control room in one of the columns.
Tanks in the pontoons keep it on an even keel and at the proper depth. 84 men work on the rig, but incredibly, few are properly trained to deal with technical problems. And the rig has already had difficulties with its emergency escape system. In 1981, Daniel O'Brien works as a diver on the Ocean Ranger. During an evacuation drill, he realizes the escape system isn't effective or safe.
When you're bringing a boat like this back up on wire falls, it's like a pendulum effect. And any physicist will tell you that when you shorten the pendulum, it starts to rock and move very violently.
As the lifeboat rises higher, it becomes even more unstable, hitting the side of the rig, its fiberglass shell breaking under the force. O'Brien talks to authorities about the escape system, but it falls on deaf ears.
I had actually made contact with several regulators. Canadian Coast Guard was the authority at the time that was in charge of inspecting vessels and escape systems. And I was told at that time that they had no involvement with the Ocean Ranger.
Since the rig is American-owned, it is outside Canadian jurisdiction. But O'Brien is told there is no reason for concern. O'Brien leaves the ship a month later, but the Ocean Ranger soon gets a new name from some of the remaining crew, the Ocean Danger.
I think that anyone you speak to who had any affiliation with that rig would tell you that there was more to that than just the words Ocean Danger. There were a lot of factors, I think, that led to that in terms of process on board, the hierarchy of and the chain of decision making. I know on at least 3 occasions when a lifeboat drill was done, the lifeboat didn't deploy at all. On one occasion when it did manage to get to the water, the engine didn't work.
February 14th, 1982. The Ocean Ranger has been operational for almost a year, but has yet to yield a single drop of oil. For the past 16 years, Bob Arsenault has been working a desk job in the company's mainland office. He is not supposed to be on board the Ocean Ranger, but it's Valentine's Day, and Arsenault helps one of the younger men on board.
It was one of the crew members that hadn't seen his wife and his children in 6 weeks, and so he had contacted Dad and said, you know, Bob, do you think that you can cover my shift for me?
Even though a storm is coming, Bob Arsenault, Joe Burry, and 82 other men go about their business as usual. In fact, the Ocean Ranger is called unsinkable, just as the Titanic was. But while the rig looks indestructible, this one is more vulnerable than any of the crew realize. Unlike most offshore oil rigs, the ballast room, which controls the rig's flotation with a series of valves operated at the control panel, is located low to the water. And instead of electronic sensors, the operator has to look out a porthole to gauge where the rig sits in the water. There is a steel cover called a deadlight over the window, but to see the water, it has to be open, exposing the window to the elements. But the weather is now much worse than expected, with hurricane-force winds. Huge waves begin crashing into the rig. The operator looks out the porthole to check the rig's depth. He, like his 83 crewmates, has no idea that in a few short hours, they will all be fighting for their lives. Off the coast of Newfoundland, on the Grand Banks, the giant Ocean Ranger oil rig looms high and invincible. A storm is coming, but for the 84 crewmen, it's business as usual.
We'd seen bad weather before, and I don't think that we necessarily thought anything differently.
The same goes for the rig's operators, including the tool pusher, whose job it is to decide when drilling starts and stops. When it's drilling, the rig sits low in the water. In bad weather, the operations stop so the rig can be raised above heavy waves. But the tool pusher and captain have miscalculated the intensity of the coming storm.
They were totally and absolutely unprepared. Totally and absolutely slack, irresponsible behavior. Beyond comprehension.
During the evening, the storm hits. It's immediately clear that it's no ordinary storm, but one of the worst in decades. Soon, waves 30 meters high pound the shell of the Ocean Ranger. But by the time the tool pusher decides to raise the rig, it's much too late. Suddenly, the glass in the ballast room's porthole crashes under the enormous force of the wave, drenching everything, including the control board. The crew manages to clean up the water, thinking no damage is done.
When the porthole smashed and poured water over the control panel, the rig lost its ability to control the water distribution.
What the ballast room operator doesn't know is that the indicator lights are malfunctioning and giving the wrong readings.
The panel was not automatically opening or closing valves anymore, and then tried to manually close valves. And it looks like they were mistaken. They thought that they were closing valves, when in fact it looks like they were opening valves.
Instead of emptying the tanks, they're filling some with water, making the rig too heavy at one end. By midnight, everyone realizes that something has gone terribly wrong. The Ocean Ranger is sinking. There is no choice but to evacuate under the worst possible conditions.
The way that you get off those structures, you have to go into lifeboats or into life rafts, or if you're lucky enough and the conditions are okay, you can be airlifted off by helicopter. In this case, they tried to evacuate by lifeboats.
The rig is tilting even further in the water. The alarm sounds. The crew races to the two lifeboats. Since there is no survival or emergency gear to protect the Ocean Ranger's men from hypothermia, many are wearing the skimpiest of clothing in bone-chilling temperatures. Others, like Joe Burry, have put on layers of clothing, but it's not enough.
He somehow had enough time to get a bit of extra clothing on, and he was wearing a life jacket, but it was actually a pad front and back with straps around it. I'm not sure if that would have even passed today's Coast Guard standards.
The lifeboats have to be lowered 24 meters into a raging sea on wire rails. And in the howling wind, the boats rock violently.
You've got an 80-foot drop to the water. So that is a long ways. I mean, that would kill a normal man. To have fallen and hit the water, it's like hitting a piece of concrete.
In the howling wind, the lifeboats crash into the sides of the steel rig, shattering their fiberglass hulls.
It's all very violent. You know that your whole world is going out from underneath your feet.
At 1 a.m. on February 15th, the Ranger contacts the onshore Mobil Oil headquarters to inform them that they need assistance. At 1:30, they radio them again and say that they are sending men to the lifeboats. As they drop into the high seas, one of the lifeboats has a gaping hole and is filling with frigid seawater. The men sit trapped, hypothermia already setting in. As the rescuers race to the location, the Ocean Ranger disappears from the radar screen. When the ships arrive, the waves are violently whipping at the lifeboats. There is almost no way to get to the men. Desperate, many do anything to be saved.
There were people who got out of the lifeboat and stood on the canopy and stood on the edge of the lifeboat holding onto the canopy, causing the boat to broach, turn upside down, throwing them into the water. And life rings were thrown to them, and people grabbed the life rings. But hypothermia, with the waves and everything going by them, just zapped the final bit of energy out of them. They lost consciousness.
If you can imagine in 80-foot waves, that's quite mountainous. You would have a lifeboat bobbing around and coming so close to rescuing people. It must have just been a horrific experience. And every time the wave had hit the boat would basically bury itself, and these men had themselves lashed to the railing.
There was a couple of cases where people reached out and they were within inches of grabbing them.
Without warning, the men plunge into the water. Only a short distance away, the Ocean Ranger slips further and further beneath the raging sea. Amid the blinding snow and winds, the sea finally swallows up the mighty Ocean Ranger. In the middle of the night, a phone call wakes Florence Arsenault. She has trouble comprehending what the words mean. She hangs up knowing only that the Ocean Ranger has sunk, and wondering if her father is strong enough to survive. By the light of day, an eerie and horrific scene unfolds. Where the Ocean Ranger once loomed is now nothing but sea and sky. Bodies bob lifelessly in the water. On the mainland, families of the crew are just beginning to hear of a disaster at sea. As the Burries prepare for the day, an incredible report comes over the radio.
I'm not sure I could relay to you how severe a blow that was. Hearing an announcement like that, I mean, there's just total disbelief. There's a lot of crying. My younger brothers were very scared.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I didn't really understand what was going on. None of us knew. We didn't know if Dad was dead or if the Ocean Ranger actually sank.
Soon, the human tragedy becomes all too clear. The entire crew of 84 are dead. Only 22 bodies are recovered.
They didn't find my dad. There will never be any closure. Closure is being able to know that he's not in that ocean. He's down there cold and alone. I think if I knew that they were able to bring him home, I think that would be closure.
It is especially difficult to deal with because Bob Arsenault was not supposed to be on board the Ocean Ranger that night.
That gentleman that Dad covered for came to apologize to my mother. He took it pretty hard because he figured that if he hadn't asked Dad to work, then my dad wouldn't have died.
It seems everyone in Newfoundland is in shock. The disaster makes headlines around the world.
In Newfoundland, the impact of the sinking of the Ocean Ranger, I think, rivaled the same situation when JFK was shot. Everybody that you talk to from Newfoundland who was around, they can tell you what they were doing when it happened. The Ranger sank on a Monday morning early. My father's body was found on a Thursday. It was the most people I'd ever seen at a funeral service. It was absolutely amazing. It was a dark day emotionally for everybody. But there was some closure because we had his body, and that meant a lot to all of us.
After the shock subsides, people look for meaning and answers.
Like every other body that was found, the autopsy determined that he had died from hypothermia. So the cold had killed him, and he hadn't drowned. No broken bones, no major cuts, no major bangs. What would have happened if there had been just a few survival suits?
That is only one of the nagging questions in the aftermath of the terrible tragedy. A royal commission is established to determine the causes of the disaster.
When we got into our studies of the Ocean Ranger and this group, the operational structure, we found that there was some disagreement as to where the chain of command started and where it ended.
The Ocean Ranger lies at the bottom of the sea, upside down. Divers go into its hulking mass for clues to the causes. The investigation reveals the disaster was due to a tragic combination of human error, violent weather, and a flaw in the design of the ballast room, the room where flotation and stability is controlled. Because of that, the ballast control room sat low to the water, vulnerable to heavy seas since the rig wasn't raised in the storm. The room's glass porthole was used for visually checking the water level.
It should never have been there. It presents a problem, potential problem with short-circuiting, which is what they expect to happen.
Because the crew was not properly trained to use the steel cover, the terrible chain reaction began.
The conditions were so severe that ultimately the lifeboats could not survive the conditions that they're being launched into. The Grand Banks are probably one of the harshest environments on Earth.
They never had a chance. No immersion suits, fully exposed to the elements. Even though they had an enclosed boat, it was damaged. It flooded. They were basically not much better off if they'd been sitting in an open life raft. They had very little.
Some believe it could have all been avoided if the tool pusher had simply stopped drilling and raised the rig out of harm's way. Some good has come of the tragedy. Since then, more sophisticated safety regulations have been put into place. Training has vastly improved, and there are more advanced methods for predicting devastating storms.
We now have a better understanding of weather forecasts, and a greater capability to forecast that so people can better prepare for these extreme events.
The Ocean Ranger went down without ever finding a drop of oil. All that is forgotten now. But what will never be forgotten are the lives of 84 men, taken for reasons still hard to comprehend.
Every year when February 15th rolls around, I think everybody in Newfoundland takes a deep breath and remembers the Ocean Ranger, whether or not you were immediately affected.
No one is ever held accountable. Some families settle with the oil company and rig owners, but it's little consolation. For those left behind, it's hard to cope with the disaster, even 2 decades later.
It was the world's largest rig, unsinkable they called it. It was, and we've heard that before at the turn of the century. And not far from where the Titanic sank, in fact. Very close, within the same waters.
The Ocean Ranger is forever lost to the sea, a mass of crumpled steel, a victim itself of the forces of nature and fatal error.
It was one of those disasters of the century, I think, that people will always remember. How could an oil company have taken 84 of our people away from us and had such an impact